Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Rambo First Blood, or in the YouTube way of saying things, Rambo review! Because you can't say the word First Blood, or you can't say the word blood. So that's great. So, with that said, I've kind of been having this kick of just reviewing action movies. Like, I started reviewing a plethora of, or a few Terminator movies, and then I started to watch some of the Universal Soldier movies, and I'm like, well, like I need to cover something with Sylvester Stallone, and I was like, well, I'm not going to cover Rocky, like I'm just not. Like I've seen the Rocky movies to a absurd degree, and I was like, I'm very hesitant about eventually reviewing those movies. I like them, like don't get me wrong, and eventually maybe I will at some point review those. It's just the fact that I'm like, well, what other besides Expendables, like what Stallone movies have been franchises? And I'm like, well, why not again, like try to go into some early Stallone movies? And I was like, well, obviously it's got to be Rambo then. I had also covered Tango and Cash. Like I'm not like saying all this to just kind of like hey, if you just appear onto this review for your first time, like. But anyways, so going into Rambo First Blood, and it's just kind of weird. It's kind of weird going and reviewing this movie because of our current time. Let's just say, if people know exactly how this movie goes, you'll understand what I mean by that. But honestly, when you look at it beyond that, I think there is a lot of great line deliveries within here, and there's a lot of like interesting things where we go on to Stallone, where Stallone throughout a bulk of this movie is a mysterious character, to where eventually we realize like really how much that this guy is so intimidating and could just fall out of the sky to get you. And like I thought that that was so interesting and so fascinating within this movie. If people know full and well, I think the main reason why I really wanted to get into this movie is just because of how vastly different that this is compared to a lot of, like, a ton of other films. In all actuality, there was this movie that Tommy Lee Jones had done before called The Hunted. I think it came out in 2003. If anything, if you actually like this movie, also check out the Tommy Lee Jones movie, The Hunted. I think uh, Del Toro, the guy that played the remaked The Wolfman, he is also in that movie. And like that movie feels very much like this, and vice versa. Because we end up having a man who is, who had taught this guy. We end up having Tommy Lee Jones going after this guy and trying to have to kill him within this forest. And I found out like that movie was like, man, this is freaking amazing. And so at some point, maybe I'll have to go back to that and watch it at some point, but it probably won't be relevant because it just won't. So with that said, like, because it's like whatever bizarrish knowledge that I have rattling around in my head could just easily just be a comparison. Also, when I started to go like immediately into this movie, I'm like, oh my god, could you imagine if this movie would have been like a Wolverine film? Like, I honestly think that um, like this movie honestly would have like worked out perfectly as like a Wolverine origin movie. Like we had it to where a lot of the beats honestly fit to where like uh, to where reasonably we could have like Wolverine just like coming back home from whatever billions of wars that he had fought, and he ends up finding out that he's an outcast simply because people end up finding out that he is a mutant. Uh, And yeah, like you could have done this the exact same way as First Blood. But with that said, yeah, I really enjoy this movie. There is this one line delivery that just sells this entire film. If not just seeing Rambo just uh, decking these guys or tricking these guys uh, or whatever, what have you. Like we have it to where when Rambo is to get right into the face of the sheriff and give him that one liner, that whole line that he delivers there, I'm like, wow, like this one line sells this entire movie, and how rare do you get that kind of thing? To where immediately you're just like, man, could I rehear that line again and again and over again, like a million times over, because it is such an amazing line that Stallone eventually delivers within this movie, to where Stallone or Rambo is consistently asking these sheriffs and these deputies to let it go, and they just won't. They keep coming after him, and he's just like, nah, okay. Like, I can just keep playing your game. Like, if you want a war, I just came from one, and I'm more than ready to uh, to to make a war here. Like I have just come from one. Like I know full well when something is brewing, and I know full well that I can definitely survive. So going into this movie, it's such an interesting movie. Even though like towards the end there, you just kind of see just Rambo just kind of uh, just blowing up buildings and firing his way through things, and it kind of gets to like, okay, like let's get to the point a little bit. Like it just seems like a bunch of uh, needless violence for no reason. Uh, or needless just blowing things up for no reason. But going into this movie, I really like how honestly just quiet Stallone is throughout this entire film. How really he only delivers lines when he absolutely needs to. That's the thing that I like about these Rambo films is we end up having this quiet Rambo like person, and we end up having someone else that has to come in and like kind of sell you this movie with dialogue, and so on and so forth. So with that said, I think it's about that time to go into spoilers. I think I got everything that I got out of this that I thought that I needed to in the cryptic like sense. So yeah, just really an enjoyable movie. Considering uh, that, like, I didn't realize, like, I wasn't even thinking about like, oh, like, how could this look if I'm watching a movie? Like, no, I just like, well, I'll just watch this and see what it's about again. Because I remembered a good portion of it. I'm like, well, let's just watch it. So, if you need to go and watch this film because of evidently you are still a Rambo fan, I believe Rambo had a number of just parts and pieces of it, but also there is also a Rambo animated series which I had found, which I thought was bizarre. Uh, if you need to go and find any of these Rambos because maybe you don't have a copy of it yourself, and you probably don't want to go into some exclusive app, whatever thing, free trial somewhere of a Stars or a Showtime or somewhere wherever the heck else to find this movie. If you have a smartphone and whichever, go on to an app called Movie Pro. They have all the Rambos. You can go ahead and watch any number of them. If maybe this first one it doesn't fit your fancy, maybe there's another one that does. So, with that said, go into a Movie Pro, or there's a number of other movie apps that you can probably do. In fact, download and find this movie and see it for the first time if you've never have. So, let's get into that double time territory, that double 5 timed count. And now, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, going into this film, we end up having Rambo simply wanting to reconnect with seemingly some of the soldiers that he had worked with, or that he had gone and went to war with. And so we end up having Rambo coming back to this town to try and find one of the people that he had worked with. So we end up having Rambo tracking this guy down to eventually find out that the one person left for him to find is actually dead, because this guy had died sometime after leaving the army. It seems that he ended up with cancer, and that ended up killing him. So we end up having Rambo, who is like, well, okay, well, I guess I just have nothing and no one. I guess I should just start making my way to wherever, just keep just thumbing my way to somewhere. Just try to, I don't know where to go now. I have nowhere to go. So we end up having Rambo just going okay, well, I guess I'll just start walking. And so we end up having the sheriff starting to drive his way in through town, and so he ends up meeting Rambo, and he's like, hey man, where are you going there, buddy? And Rambo is like, oh well, I'm going north. And he's like, oh well, you're going north? Well, hey, let me help you get there a little bit quicker. Let me help you make your way there. And so we end up having Rambo, who has to just kind of forcibly go within this cop car. And so we end up having William Teasel, I think his name is. But I'm probably just going to call him William for the rest of it. Or I'll probably just call him Teasel for the rest of this. Or I'll probably just call him Sheriff. I'll probably just call him Sheriff. So we end up having the Sheriff driving Rambo to this bridge. And so we end up having the Sheriff asking Rambo again, where exactly he is going. And we end up having Rambo telling him, Pittsburgh, which is actually a completely opposite direction. And so we end up having William mentioning, it's so where are you going, buddy? So, Rambo is north. And he's like, oh, okay, all right, okay, sure. It's well, hey, man, you end up having that USA flag onto the side of your chest there, and, it's probably going to start causing some problems around here. If anything, you look like a drifter, and we don't like drifters around here, because immediately when we start seeing one of you, we're gonna start seeing a number of you all just kind of around here. So I want to kick drifters out of my town. And so we end up having Rambo asking William, hey, is there a good place to eat? And William says no. So we end up having Rambo getting to this bridge, and so William leaves him there. So we end up having Rambo, who I honestly don't believe really absolutely wanted to leave this town. I think recently, there was nowhere for him to go. And plus, I think he's well, I don't care what that sheriff says. I just want a good meal, and then I'm out of here. And so Rambo ends up recrossing the bridge, and the sheriff drives back to just go and arrest Rambo, because it's dude, you don't listen good, do you? You don't listen well. So we end up having the sheriff booking Rambo for resisting arrest and all kinds of bogus charges that don't actually make sense. And so we end up having Rambo bringing in we end up having the sheriff bringing in Rambo to, like, bizarrely, like, I guess Rambo was immediately going to go to court the very next day. I'm like, I'm sorry, shouldn't this guy have been held for like 2 days and then just would have been released? Like, I don't get it. Like, how, like, they were coming up with a bunch of bogus charges that didn't make any sense. And then they just, like, were just saying, like, okay, well, like, your court appearance is going to be the next day and you don't probably have anything to pay for that because I bet you don't have a buck to your name. So we immediately have it to where uh, Rambo is rightfully enough being difficult. So we end up having Rambo sitting down, and we end up having one of the deputies asking Rambo. We end up having Galt. Galt. We end up having Galt asking Rambo what his name is. Like, hey Rambo, what's your name? John Rambo? What is your name, John Rambo? Let me know what your name is. So we end up having Rambo not saying anything, not giving up his name, and so we end up having one of the other associates, which is Mitch, realizing that since this guy is in the army, that hey, he has some dog tags. So we end up having Mitch grabbing Rambo's dog tags, and Rambo kind of gets offended by that. But eventually, Mitch grabs the dog tags because Galt kind of mentions that, like, he's going to hurt him if Rambo steps out of line. So we have it to where Mitch grabs Rambo's dog tags and they figure out that his name is John Rambo. So like, oh, okay, well, at least we have his name then. So we end up having it to where Rambo ends up going into the cell, and then Galt ends up taking his club and knocking Rambo's knees to where Rambo ends up falling to the ground. Because we end up having at some point that Rambo is taking off his shirt to reveal that he has a number of scars. And so the detectives are like, oh my god, like, what is this guy into? Like, what is wrong with this guy? And we end up seeing flashbacks of Rambo being tortured overseas, and we are to understand, like, oh, okay, well, like, this guy was, like, probably a prisoner of war, and that he was pretty beat up and scarred. So we eventually have it to where they are to, I guess, clean this guy up so that way he can be prepared for his court hearing. And so what ends up happening bizarrely is Rambo ends up getting naked, and so they just end up like pelting him with this hose. And I'm like, oh my god! I'm like, this is ridiculous. But I guess it's like some other prisons, like I guess they just like have these things there to just like, well, like some people just don't have showers. So anyways, so we go on here, and so Rambo is eventually pelted with this hose, and like we eventually have them like going like, yeah, get behind the ears and all kinds of things, just kind of really mocking this guy as he's like naked, just being like pelted with this hose. So we eventually have it to where John Rambo eventually gets all cleaned up, and so we eventually have it to where they are still pinging on Rambo, and eventually it just gets to the point to where like they're wanting him to eventually give fingerprints, and he just won't. Every single time, like, they are pushing his fingers down, like he just won't do it, or he'll try to clean his fingers off. And we end up having it to where the sheriff is just kind of like, God, I'm getting like really annoyed with this guy. Like he just like won't do exactly what we tell him to do. And so we end up having it to where eventually like enough just becomes enough to where eventually at some point we end up having one of the deputies going uh and needing to shave Rambo, because I'm like, why would they go out of their way to shave Rambo? This seems like a this seems like a not needed thing to do. Like seems like a very excessive thing to do. It's like, dude, like I'm not gonna like I would not cut this man's hair. I would not shave him. I would just be like, oh well, here's a hose. You're clean. There you go. Like I don't see like at a prison where they're like shaving and cutting a man's hair, but I guess maybe this is just a call of the time, or maybe this was just an excessive thing that they just needed to do to build up this movie. So we end up having Rambo needing to be basically choked to get shaved. And so we end up having it to where one of the other deputies are like saying like, dude, don't you realize that this guy is like crazed? Like, can you just see that his like eyes and something about him is just wrong? Like, I think it was kind of funny when the sheriff was talking to Rambo as Rambo was getting out of the sheriff's car when he was at that bridge, how the sheriff was basically telling him, it's like, well, hey, like if you get a nice pair of clothes and you get a haircut, it's like maybe people won't treat you like garbage. But once he's here, I guess getting a shave is still being treated like garbage. So we end up having it to where the closer that this deputy ends up coming with this razor, the more Rambo starts to freak out. To the point of him like almost kicking people away because he doesn't want that blade anywhere near close to him. Plus, this deputy is like, hey, like, calm down or I'm going to cut you, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Rambo just starts beating the living crap out of all these deputies because he just can't take it anymore. And there's a blade coming to his face. So, like, he doesn't trust these people as far as he can throw them. So, he eventually ends up just beating his way through all of these detectives. And he ends up grabbing his knife and ends up running out of this police station. And so we end up having it decided that all the sheriffs and all the deputies are coming after Rambo. And so we end up having Rambo like running through the town to make it to this kind of foresty like area. It seems that we end up having Rambo who just has a tank top on and pair of jeans and shoes. And so we end up having Rambo finding these odd locations where he ends up finding a thing of string and he ends up finding some sheet. We end up having Rambo creating some poncho for himself, so I guess he can keep himself warm, because this is like survival 101, where it's like kind of make a extra layer of clothing for you as you can so you can be able to survive. So because we end up eventually having it to a Rambo in town before we make it to the actual poncho part. We end up having Rambo who runs out of town and grabs a man's motorcycle and makes his way to this forest. And the sheriff ends up trying to chase him down with his vehicle, but his vehicle ends up rolling over into these rocks. And so we end up having the sheriff yelling out to Rambo, it's like, dude, there's nowhere you can run, like, we're gonna get you. And so we eventually have the sheriff calling on to his deputies to say, it's like, dude, we need like a guy that has a bunch of dogs that can track this guy. We need the helicopter up. Like, we need everything. So we eventually go on to we eventually have Galt, who is put into this helicopter, and so we end up having seemingly Rambo trying to make his way through this forest. He's ending up like rock climbing and all kinds of things to try and make his way as far as humanly possible away from these sheriffs and these deputies. So we end up having eventually that this helicopter eventually comes. And so we end up having Galt, who is having a rifle of sorts and is planning on killing Rambo, uh, regardless if the kill is justified or not. And so we end up having it to where Galt is on helicopter making his way to Rambo. And so we end up having it to where Rambo is like rock climbing his way to making it to somewhere safe. And so we end up having Galt firing upon Rambo. And so Rambo ends up deciding, well, dude, I'm either going to die or like I'm going to jump onto this tree and hope that I can like hide somewhere in this tree. So Rambo goes and he jumps onto this tree and he ends up nailing himself onto a number of different branches, and eventually he ends up smacking into this one branch, and I think he ends up like breaking a rib or something, and he's like, oh my god, and then he freaking lands onto the very like he ends up landing onto the ground and screaming in pain. So, and I thought that scene was just like, God, that scene looks so like everything about Rambo just looks really uh like in the aspect of it all, like it looks really awesome. Like it looks like this guy is like really just in desperation, and like everything looks really great, and plus I'm sure that really sucked just like pa and freaking hit with all those branches on his way down through that tree. So we end up seeing that it seems that Rambo's arm had been cut up by those branches, and so we end up having Galt, who is firing upon this tree, and so we end up having it to where the helicopter pilot is giving any other reasons why Galt should not be doing this, or that this helicopter pilot is just trying to like do a job that Galt does not like. And so we end up having it to where Galt is like, dude, you gotta keep this helicopter steady or I'm gonna kill you myself. And so we end up having this helicopter guy just going like, oh crap. Like God, like who is the worst person here? So we end up having Galt consistently firing at this tree. So eventually we end up having Rambo, who ends up finding a rock, and he ends up chucking it and directly hits this helicopter in this windshield with this rock, which ends up kind of jucking this helicopter, and eventually Galt ends up falling out of the helicopter if he hadn't almost done that numerous times already, and he ends up falling to his death. So we end up having Rambo reaching to Galt, and he ends up looking at this guy who is all bloody and whatever, and he ends up just looking at the guy and then stealing his coat. And so we end up having it to where eventually the sheriff and the deputy arrive to find Galt and realize that he is dead, to where we end up having the sheriff and the deputies wanting to even more to get this guy just because they got one of theirs. But we end up having Rambo, who ends up going out and putting his hands up saying that he's done nothing wrong, and that they drew first blood, and that they should like stop doing what they're doing. But eventually, we have one of the deputies who end up starting to just shoot at Rambo, and I think they end up almost like hitting him in the eye or something, to where Rambo ends up running off, and the sheriffs just start firing, and then the sheriff like calls him off, like, stop firing, like, what are you guys doing? So we end up having Rambo realize that this is never going to stop. And so we end up having him to where he's basically like, okay, you guys want a war, like, well, come on. We end up having to where Rambo ends up sewing up his arm, to where I'm like, well, wait a minute, didn't he before like go and have like pour powder over his wound and like light it on fire? And that might have been in some sequel or something like that, but I thought I saw something like that before. But anyways, so we go on and we have Rambo go on to eventually, I guess, set up traps for a lot of the sheriff and the deputy to eventually fall upon. We eventually have the sheriff and the deputies eventually get this guy who can track down this Rambo with dogs. And so we end up having it to where Rambo had been able to get the gun from Galt. So now we have some kind of even keel like thing, to where Rambo just doesn't have a knife anymore, because we end up having it to where the reason why Rambo ended up getting arrested was because he had a knife on him, which we end up having the sheriff asking Rambo, it's like, well, hey, like, what do you use this knife for? Rambo's like, hunting, and the sheriff's like, well, what do you hunt? And he ends up saying like, I think he ends up saying like the enemy. I think is his response. So we go along, and so we end up finding out that one of the deputies had heard some information that, or I think the sheriff and the deputy end up hearing through walkies that this Rambo character is actually a Green Beret, and that he's like a numerous award winner or whatever for being in Vietnam. And so we end up having a lot of the deputies saying like, dude, you've got to be kidding me. And like some of the deputies are like, dude, like Green Beret, that's no joke. It's like, and so we end up having them just realizing that like, dude, what did we step ourselves into? Like, this is insane. So we end up having these deputies and these sheriffs go along with these dogs, and so we end up having eventually this dog tracker who evidently has dogs that can eat while they hunt things down, and so isn't that great? So we end up pushing along, and so we eventually have these dogs that eventually end up seemingly finding upon Rambo, and so one by one we end up having this this dog tracker like letting loose all these dogs, and one by one we end up having Rambo starting to kill some of the dogs off camera. Good for that at least. And then eventually we end up having the dog tracker guy. He ends up getting like shot in the leg, and he ends up dropping to the ground. And so we end up having the dog tracker guy telling the sheriff to like make sure you kill that son of a, like, he killed my dogs. What kind of a person kills a dog? It's like, well, obviously dogs who want to go and attack Rambo, what is he going to do? So we have these deputies going further along into this forest to start to realize that one by one, eventually they are going to get trapped somehow, one or the other. We end up having Balford, who ends up saying that Green Berets aren't any joke. He ends up getting his legs stabbed by some stick device that ends up getting like some booby trap that he ends up walking into, and the sticks end up swinging in and swinging onto his legs, which basically stabs his legs to where he's like, "Oh my God, Will, help!" We end up having also that like quite a bit of all these deputies end up having Rambo like sneak up behind them, stabbing them in the leg, and so like they're screaming out, Will. So we end up having it to where like everybody's scrambling, so like what the heck is going on? We eventually have one of the other deputies ending up getting again taken by Rambo and end up getting tied to some tree. And so we eventually have it to where every single deputy of this sheriff eventually ends up getting taken out one way or the other by some trap, or just having eventually like Rambo ends up jumping from this high spot to eventually fall on top of them and end up either injuring them some way or stabbing them some way or something along those lines. So we eventually end up having this sheriff being the only one that is really and truly left. So we eventually end up having Rambo end up sneaking up behind the sheriff and ended up pushing him against this tree and end up putting a knife to his throat. And this is the best line of this whole entire movie, to where we ended up having Rambo telling the sheriff, it's like, well, hey, like I gave you guys an opportunity to like stop. Like, you may be the law in town, but I am the law here. It's like you wanted a war, and I gave it to you, and so just let this go, kind of thing. And I'm probably not saying it the best, all perfectly, and so on and so forth, but that line, however it goes within the movie, like, is probably the greatest line that I've ever heard, where it's just like, no, like whoever you are in town is nothing to me, and I could have easily killed you here, but like I could have killed you. I could have killed all your men, but I didn't. So let it go. Like, this whole line delivery is like, it's like, I could have killed them. I could have killed you. You might be the law in town, but I'm the law here. And so let it go. Let it go. And so we end up having Rambo just like going off, and so we end up having, of course, the sheriff not letting this go still. We end up having it to where they end up calling like the National Guard in and all these kinds of military-ish like characters. They end up calling the state police, and the state police is saying like, well, like, since it's our jurisdiction, like, we're taking over now. And the sheriff is just like, no, like, I don't give a crap about all your jurisdiction stuff. Like, no, you're not taking this one from me. And so we end up having this guy named Trotman, who, of course, is going to be a big part of this Rambo franchise. It seems like he's going to be involved in these movies one way or the other. And so we end up having Trotman coming in here and like saying like, oh, well, like, I'm the guy that's going to be the kind of the wild card, the like the best option that you've got. And we end up having it to where the sheriff looks at Trotman and he's like, well, who the heck are you? And Trotman's like, well, you're after Rambo, right? I'm the guy who trained him. So we end up having Trotman telling Will like it is, basically telling him it's like, dude, like you're fighting a war that you can't win. Like no matter how many guys that you're going to send against him, you're gonna have to also send a lot of body bags along with those men because it's just not going to work. We end up having Trotman basically telling us like every little bit of backstory that we didn't get of Rambo to help us understand how good he is, how he has learned to ignore things uh, like drinking or food or weather or anything, uh, and he has learned to survive in any kind of circumstance because really uh, he is a guy that ultimately kills and asks questions later. Like that's how Rambo is basically. So we end up having Trotman really building up Rambo for us if he hasn't really been built up perfectly at this point. And so, like, I think about that point, like, it's kind of an overkill like thing. Like, I wish that we could have had, like, the Trotman thing, like, early on in this movie instead of it being, like, after the whole line delivery of just, like, well, you're the law in town, but I'm the law here. And so let it go. Uh, but anyways, I can't let that line go because it's awesome. But I probably effed it up, so I apologize. Um, I could have killed them. I could have killed you. You might be the law in town, but I'm the law here. Anyways, so that line is so fun. It's so like, cause it's like it's just like a spinning of control where, and I love that kind of line where where like it's kind of like a villain thinks that they can control the situation, that they can win, and the hero is just like, no, no, evidently, like, you didn't realize how much willpower I have compared to you. Like, how I'm just going to do anything to win, even if it costs me my own life, even if it means that both of us lose. But I will still win in the process because you will no longer exist. Uh, that is the kind of interesting debacle of when, like, we get a hero that is gonna go and do every single thing to win in the end. That's the kind of heroes that I enjoy. Is the heroes that are just like, well, even when even when the villain uh, is going to win, I'm still going to come up with a strategy to get back at him and still uh, beat him anyways. So going along, we end up having Trotman uh, and William coming up with a plan, or Will, who is coming up with a plan to say, like, well, hey, since Trotman knows him, how about we get Trotman to talk to Rambo on the walkie? And so we end up having Trotman talking to Rambo on the walkie, and we end up having it to where, like, I kind of thought originally when I originally saw this movie, I thought that Rambo was like reliving his past through this movie. But then I realize now, I'm like, oh, no, no, no. Like, Rambo's not reliving his past. It's just the fact that everything from his war days, he has lost everything and everyone. And now that since somebody is getting into his face and is causing all these problems against Rambo, then Rambo is just like, well, the only thing that I know is war, so here we are. So we end up having Troutman talking to Rambo as if when Rambo was at war, kind of mentioning about some of the men that he had lost in his war, trying to think that maybe Rambo has some still post traumatic stress like thing that maybe if Trotman can reconnect with Rambo through a war scenario, that will get Rambo to talk. So we eventually have it to where the sheriff is thinking that if they are to get Rambo on this walkie, they can figure out where his location is. Where I'm like, I don't quite understand how exactly they can do that because that does not make sense to me. How they can figure out where his walkie-talkie signal is, that makes no sense. But it is what it is, I guess. So, and it feels just kind of like a tracking situation in a movie where you end up having like a ransom note being sent to your home, and so the victims or the people who are having to call the bad guys, and the police are tracing the number, and they're like, oh, get them on hold or put them on the phone for like 10 minutes and then we'll be able to track them down. That doesn't happen either. That would, you would be able to figure out where the phone number is like in like seconds, not in like 10 minutes, and then eventually they hang up and they're like, oh, that happens immediately. But anyways, so we go on and we have Troughton talking to Rambo, and we end up having Rambo mention that he's lost everyone. That we end up having Trotman mention like, well, hey, there's still one left alive, and Rambo's like, no, like he died. During the war too. Like cancer had eaten him alive. So we end up having Rambo like arguing with Trotman about how Trotman is saying like, well, hey man, like you've caused a real problem for these people in this town here, and it's like, well, Rambo's like, dude, I was just minding my own business, and like this King Cop person like really got into my face, and so what was I supposed to do? So we eventually have it to where Trotman is trying to bring Rambo in, and Rambo has no interest in even talking to Trotman and whatever. So past that point. So we eventually have it to where they decide to send in the Army Reserve to go and try to hunt down Rambo. They end up trying to shoot him down, and that doesn't work. We eventually have it to where eventually the reserve guys are going like, well, dude, like, how about we just like we're just gonna blow up the cave of which that Rambo is in and call it a day. And so, because none of them really want to go further in to try to get at Rambo, and so they otherwise decide to just like, dude, let's just blow up this cave and we'll call it a day. We'll say that he's dead. So we end up having the reserve people like saying like, dude, we got him, and the sheriff is like, well, like I want a body, I want proof. And so the reserve guys are like, dude, I'm not gonna dig this guy up. And so the sheriff is like, well, like you better, because I want proof that this guy is dead. And so we have Trotman, who is just like, dude, this guy is definitely going to survive. There's going to be a hole in this cave somewhere. He's going to make it out, but he doesn't tell anyone else that. So we end up having Trotman, who is just hanging out in town, and we have it to where the sheriff is going and talking to Trotman, and the sheriff is like, well, hey, like, what would have happened if you would have been able to get Rambo out of here? Would you have given him a big hug and a big kiss? Because we end up having the sheriff wanting to have killed Rambo so badly, and so we end up having it to where like Trotman throws some shade at the sheriff, and so we end up having the sheriff in kind throwing some shade back. Really, we end up having it to where Trotman kind of mentions how Rambo was when they were in war together, how basically everything became so easy in war because they were given orders and they were basically just told to just kill. Like, don't question, just kill. And so, really, we end up having it to where we end up finding that the sheriff just thinks that it's very uneasy that Trotman uh, didn't just leave right away. So we eventually have within the next day that it seems that Rambo had made his way through this cave and had exit out of it, and he ended up uh, stealing one of these army cars, or one of these army vehicles, and he ends up taking the weapon that is inside of it, and he ends up just firing away upon this town, trying to take down uh, certain buildings and stuff like that that he deems important. So we end up having it to where there is a radio that ends up saying that, hey guys, like, I think somebody pulled the cord on that a little bit too quickly. It seems like Rambo is back in town. And so we end up having the sheriff, who immediately goes to Trotman, and he is like, wait a minute. So that's why you didn't leave this town? Because you knew that Rambo would survive that explosion. You knew he was going to still be alive. You knew there was going to be an opportunity for you to collect your Rambo. You knew that was going to happen. And Trotman was like, well, I hoped. Like, I'm not going to say immediately that, like, I knew. No. Like, so we end up having Rambo. We end up having Rambo. We have Rambo just running through town, gunning down everything with Rambo. We end up having Rambo going through with this big, huge gun and all these big, flashy bullets. And so we end up having Rambo just ransacking this town. He ends up going and blowing half of these buildings up. He ends up going into the entire shop that has a bunch of bullets, and he ends up basically blowing this whole a gun shop up. So we eventually have it to where still the only cop left in town is actually just the sheriff. And so we eventually have it to where while Rambo is going and blowing up the gun shop, we eventually see the sheriff sticking his head from off of this roof. And so we end up seeing that Rambo sees the sheriff sticking his head off of some roof. And so we end up having eventually where the sheriff or to where Rambo is just kind of like putting bullets into every single building. And so we eventually have it to where Rambo ends up shooting his way through the sheriff's office, and eventually we have it to where Rambo ends up making his way to the sheriff, and we have Rambo almost killing the sheriff, but then Trotman ends up trying to stop him from killing the sheriff. To showcase to Rambo that it's like, dude, you need to stop. Can't you see what's going on outside? Can't you see the number of police and everything that is lined up to kill you? This is a war that you cannot win. So you need to stop. Come with me. I will help you. And so we end up having Rambo having this meltdown where we end up having Rambo mention how when he had come back from war, how people called him a baby killer and all these kind of awful things, and that he went to war and he uh, had gone and uh, been in tanks and helicopters and $1 million equipment. But when he ends up going back home, he can't even get a job at parking cars. And so we end up having Rambo just like he ends up telling us about these war stories where he ended up having a friend there that wanted to um, go home and just drive his '57 Chevy, and that if anything, Rambo wanted to do that with him, and so a lot of the guys just ended up getting like just so exhausted and so tired, and eventually all they wanted to do was just go home, and so we end up having at some point that the guys were all exchanging beers, and then eventually they ended up finding out that there was seemed to have been a bomb where they were at, and so we end up having Rambo, who had chunks and pieces of one of his friends um, like thrusted upon him, and so we end up having Rambo, who had to like recollect his friend back into his body, kind of thing, and to where all that Rambo remembered is his friend just wanting to go home, and so we end up having Rambo just like to the point to you can't exactly hear every single thing that he's saying, but you can just tell that he has this like gigantic meltdown. And so we end up having Trotman just trying to have to comfort Rambo as best as he could. And Rambo ends up just like hugging on the Trotman and just crying in his shoulder. And so we eventually have Rambo eventually walking out of this sheriff's office in handcuffs and a coat, and Trotman is following him uh, through this whole process. Because we end up having the detectives confessing that, or the deputies confessing that they were a little rough on Rambo, and we end up having also to where they are also saying to Rambo, it's like, well, hey, we're going to take um, all the accolades and all the stuff that you've accomplished when you were in the military. We're going to take that into consideration for your sentence or uh, for whatever we're going to do with you. So we end up having it to where both Rambo and Trotman are to make their way to the police car, and that's how this movie just ends. So with that said, I think I'm going to end this review. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.